We spoke about dealing with some men who had deliberately killed other human beings.
Mhm.
Is there one particular person that sticks out in your memory?
There are a few. Um, yes, there was a
Maybe the one that was the most difficult for you.
um, this man was probably the most fascinating, but it's very, very disturbing. So I don't know how much detail you want me to go
All of
into.
it. All of it.
Okay, he worked in a slaughterhouse, and he was young. He almost certainly had some educational needs, some learning difficulties. He also probably had a personality disorder, but that wouldn't have been necessarily evident to people who were working with him at the time.
Like schizophrenia?
Psychopathy. But this particular individual probably had all those characteristics. What happened for him is that he found himself getting sexually aroused to the slaughter of the animals. So he got an interest in blood. Um, he he fantasized about that, and that turned into a fantasy about killing a person. So he deliberately set out to make that happen.
Is that a problem in the nervous system? It's a problem because of the storyline of his life?
Um, there, well, the one thing I would say is that I have never met a really high risk offender who hasn't had major trauma, abuse, and neglect in their childhood. And I know people will say, oh, psychologists are very warm and fluffy about offenders. You know, you're always looking for an excuse. Well, it's not an excuse because it's a reality. So I remember writing a report on a man who'd been in what we used to call the dangerous and severe personality disorder units in prisons. I'd never met him, but I was sent all his file information to write an objective report. And his offence was horrific. He'd murdered a teenager. He had deposited her body in a dustbin. It was just awful. And I remember reading it feeling quite disturbed. But then I read about his childhood, and that disturbed me as much. So, as a 3-year-old, he had been left in a back garden with a dog collar around his neck, chained to a washing line in the rain as a punishment. Now, how we would expect somebody who'd experienced that in childhood to grow up and be pro social and law abiding and respect the rules, it's a ridiculous ask. You know, how could we expect somebody who's experienced that
Kind of makes you
to,
grateful for your own childhood as well.
oh, doesn't it? Yeah, it absolutely does. Yeah. So I think there is almost certainly for the most serious offenders, there will be elements of their history that will help understand why they've ended up in the place they've ended up. I have met plenty of offenders who are less serious, who've had come from perfectly decent backgrounds and really have absolutely no indication that they were going to end up committing offences. But the most serious ones, without without it omission, they would have had a hideous, hideous childhood. A childhood in care, a childhood with neglect, abuse, um, lacking lots of physical violence. Yeah, horrific, really. You don't really even want to think about it. It's hard.
This particular human,
Mm,
uh, he had a very traumatic childhood.
mm,
He used to work in a slaughterhouse
mm,
and he would get aroused because of killing the animals in the
mm,
slaughterhouse.
mm,
And that led to
mm,
him having a thought that, hey, what what would I feel
mm,
if I killed human beings instead?
mm,
This is kind of the image that most of us have about serial
mm,
killers because of
mm,
movies
mm,
and shows like
mm,
Dexter, that there's got to
mm,
be some level of arousal or
mm.
some dopamine rush
Yeah,
because of the sake of.
yeah. I think in the case of sexually motivated murder, there are, if you pair orgasm with deviant thoughts, the pairing becomes very strong. So when one of the things that we needed to understand was about masturbatory fantasy, which is really, really hard for people to talk about. And obviously, some men might enjoy talking about that to a woman. And you had to be really careful in your job about making sure that this was part of a therapeutic process and not part of something else. But understanding why perhaps violence or other people's fear would arouse somebody is something that needs to be addressed. And we worked hard. I wasn't involved in this element of the work in prisons, but there were programs to help kind of desensitize, disconnect the arousal to the fantasy and the action.
I would assume this is a one-off thing, but the way
Mm,
you're describing it right now, it
mm.
seems like there was multiple people who felt.
Not that many. The thing is, when you're in prison, you feel you're immersed in a world of sexual violence and deviance. So it's easy to believe that everybody is sexually violent and deviant because that's where you are every day. Whereas actually, that's a tiny percentage. I think I don't know the percentage of men convicted of sexual offence in prison against the whole prison population, but it's really small. But when you're immersed in it, it becomes your whole world. So it feels like it's everywhere, but it isn't. It's very rare, very, very rare. Statistically, it's rare. And this is, I mean, one of the things, it's interesting when people work with men who've been convicted of sexual offences. And what got me interested in what I currently do is how it plays with their head and this belief that everybody's really dangerous and that it affects the way people behave with their children and they don't want to be alone with their kids and they don't want to bath their own children because they're so fearful because they've got all this stuff in their head that they've heard from offenders who have behaved in that way. And actually I took a rather opposite view and felt that that knowledge and understanding actually really helped me grow up my daughter and my foster children in a way that was balanced and sane and kept them safer. So whilst most people might think that men who are convicted of or commit sexual offences are the stranger in the street with the dirty mac on and got no friends, actually the reality is most people know their abusers. Most children know the men or women who abuse them. And so for me, when my daughter was little and going on sleepovers, I was really aware and cautious and did my own kind of risk assessment about, and also was able to have conversations age appropriate with her about her body and when to say no. And, if an adult tells you to keep a secret, you don't keep it. If don't tell mum, then the first thing you do is tell me. And we had that relationship where she was able to do that from a young age, but without scaring her either. So I actually found the work an incredibly empowering thing on a personal level rather than a terrifying and scary one. But that's probably a whole other conversation.
I'm happy to explore all of this, which is why I told you before the show began that I think we're
Yeah.
going to have a very long, tangential conversation. Um, okay, why was that particular man difficult for you to work with?
In himself, he wasn't. He's one of the things that became really important in the work is you have to find something to like in the people that you work with. Otherwise, you can't do it. And nobody is all bad. Nobody. Although it's really, really hard sometimes to find the good. I mean, the risk of being hideously political, I think about Donald Trump. Not my cup of tea. I would never vote for him, but half of America think he's marvelous, slightly more than half America. So even though I might listen to the things he says and go, oh, God, how can you say such a thing? Other people love it. And that's the whole point, really. So bringing that back to serial killing psychopaths, nobody is all bad. I think what made him hard was he was very graphic in when he eventually told us what had happened. It took a long time. You have to form a relationship with somebody for them to disclose that stuff. His original explanation of his offence was that the kiss he offered to his victim as a thank you for an Easter egg was rejected, so he killed her. That's what he told us. He was rejected, so he killed her. But actually, when you really begin to, it didn't make any sense. It's a very extreme thing to do, isn't it? When someone says, please don't kiss me, it's just to kill them. So it didn't make sense. And that's your job as a psychologist, is to say, well, in that situation, what you're telling me doesn't make sense. There's more to this, and I need you to help me understand. Talk me through what happened. And it took a long time. So you are immersed in their minds, and that's hard. That's not a job for everybody.
Did you have to gain his trust? That's basically
Yes,
what it is. He
absolutely.
perceived
Yeah.
you as a friend first and then opened up to you.
Um, that's a really interesting question. I remember when I started in prison, be friendly but not friends. You're not friends with the offenders. You can't be. It would breach a boundary, but you do need to develop a very strong therapeutic rapport. So if I were his friend, I'd be telling him all about my life too, which obviously you don't do. So the boundary issue is a really important one in prisons and in therapeutic work. And you've got to be very clear where the lines are. the line you don't cross. And most of that's professional, but also some of it's personal. It's about what am I prepared to share to build a relationship, because you have to give something of yourself, otherwise you can't build a relationship. So working that out in the course of working with an offender. There's another offender I worked with actually who I I found really hard to like, but we had to do a thorough assessment of his offending, and um, and I had to work really hard at building a rapport with him, but we managed it.
We spoke about uh, him gradually opening up to you.
Yes.
You know how we're doing a podcast right now? I'm sure you've gotten to know things about me as well just through the conversation.
Yeah.
But in that case, you're talking to probably one of the most difficult
Mm.
murderers that you've spoken to in your career.
Yeah.
Um, Little weird question, but in that phase of your life, did you get dreams about this situation at all? Did it affect your head at all?
So yes, of course, it couldn't not. But that's really what got me into what I do now, is how do you understand why some people are impacted negatively by the work and other people aren't? And why might we be impacted more at various stages in our life than others? So one thing that, just as an example, first of all, you have your own supervision. So you have somebody to go and discuss things with and process it with. I think also it depends on how well resourced you are outside of work. And one of the things that happened during the time I was working on the unit with that particular and many other very, very dangerous offenders, I got pregnant. So, and in those days in the prison service, you were still allowed to continue working with offenders when you were pregnant. And I actually, I'm laughing because I think back and think, I don't know how I did that, but I worked up until the Friday before the Monday my daughter was born. So and I was literally 9 months pregnant.
Does she enjoy crime documentaries?
Yeah. So I don't know what I think I was doing. Anyway, my poor daughter, I don't know what she would have heard while she was in utero. But anyway, um, and I knew that I couldn't carry on doing that job once I became a new mum. I knew that once I become pregnant, I thought I'm going to have to stop doing this work once she's born, because that would have made me incredibly vulnerable. So, an awareness of your own vulnerabilities, awareness of your own skills, your own strengths, your own resilience, knowing when to ask for help, knowing when to stop, and that it's probably interests you because it's relevant. At the time I was pregnant, one of the men on the unit had actually murdered a pregnant woman. Um, and she and her baby had died. And whilst I was pregnant, I was fine. I was, for some reason, I don't know, maybe it was the hormones, just it didn't threaten me, it didn't disturb me. But I had my daughter, I had 3 months maternity leave because that's all you're allowed. I had to go back onto the unit to clear all my stuff out because I moved to a new job at prison service headquarters. And that particular prisoner, and I remember it so clearly, he was stood at the top of the stairs in the unit, and we'd always got on really well. And he said, "Oh, Joe, how are you? How's your baby?" And in that moment, I wanted to kill him. It was really fascinating. And this is why I'm saying to you about, what happens, particularly when you're a parent, I think, that desire to protect your young. And I remember thinking, if I was stood at the top of the stairs with you, I'd probably have pushed you down them. How dare you
Oh,
even ask me? Up until that point, I'd been fine with him. So it really, I think, makes the point about your circumstances, how you're feeling, your vulnerability, your resources, the support you've got. All of that makes a difference.
do you think he asked it as a threat?
No, I really don't think he did. I think he was genuinely trying to be pro-social. I don't think he was being nasty at all. He wasn't one of those offenders that would be classed as a psychopath. He made some very serious, I was going to say mistakes. That sounds like so belittling of what he actually did. He did some hideous thing. He did a hideous thing, and it was very difficult to work with. But he wasn't in the same category for me as the other guys we've been talking about.